President Ramaphosa has just delivered his Freedom Day address. Of course, for more on this, we cross to our reporter Samkele Maseko, who's been observing that speech. Thanks very much for joining us, Samkele. A very powerful speech that he gave, really emphasizing a lot on people working together in the country, not only to beat COVID-19, but also to work together to rebuild this economy.
Yes, indeed, Desiree, a very powerful speech by President Cyril Ramaphosa, specifically on the issue of contrasting a country divided into two nations, that of the haves and the have-nots. Basically speaking of a child whom he was alluding that there will be a child that is born in a well-off family, who would go to the good schools, who would have a future well set out for them, whose prospects of succeeding in life are good and are well in order, as compared to a child who's born to an impoverished family in the informal settlements, in the rural areas, in the shacks. The destiny of that child is very bleak, as opposed to that child who's born to a well-off and affluent family. Speaking to the societal and the socio-economic conditions that the masses of South Africa are subjected to and are impoverished, he went on to say that South Africans must work together and revive this shattered economy, saying that the COVID-19 pandemic has presented South Africa with an opportunity to work together, where the haves and those who are in business cannot ignore the plight of those who go to bed without anything to have eaten, who have issues of not knowing where they will find their next shelter. So these are some of the issues that the president was speaking to, and speaking to about a promise that was there on the 27th of April in 1994 that has not yet succeeded. Basically saying that there's freedom and democracy for some, whilst it's not the case for others.
Indeed, that is the case. Of course, the president also speaking about the Cubans coming into the country. How significant is that?
That's very significant, Desiree, particularly when you look at the history of South Africa and Cuba. Griselda Lewis, our colleagues, dubs it as the Cuba-South Africa Incorporation. Basically looking at the history of El Comandante, the former president of Cuba, Fidel Castro, and the relationship that he had with the late former statesman of South Africa, the first democratic president, Nelson Mandela. For instance, earlier on today, I was looking at a clip of former President Nelson Mandela on his trip to Cuba, where he was meeting President Fidel Castro, in saying that South Africa's friends, all of them have come to our shores, but the one country that was there in helping South Africa through the liberation struggle with arms and with education, Cuba, President Fidel Castro, has not come to our shores. You'd look at the relationship that the two countries have had over the years. They've been alongside one another in the trenches in the liberation of South Africa. South Africa drawing a lot of through the Cuban Revolution. It also go to the various medical students that go abroad and go to Cuba to seek assistance for education from provinces all over the 9 provinces of the country. The relationship that the two countries has, and with Cuba deploying over 200 of its medical practitioners and doctors coming to help South Africa fight this invisible enemy of COVID-19. So these are some of the similarities that these two countries have. For instance, the president himself, whilst he was still the deputy president of the Republic of South Africa, in one of the years during the last 5 years of former President Jacob Zuma, in one of those years, President Cyril Ramaphosa, then Deputy President, did embark on a personal trip to Cuba to seek assistance, to learn in Cuba and what the Cubans have done for this particular country of ours.
And then, Samkele, just in terms of the speech, the president talking around, making sure that impoverished areas of the country get more water and get improved access to food and all of that, it is rather lamentable that it took a crisis for the government to get on top of this very issue.
Desiree, what I found very impactful in the president's speech, he first started off in saying the promise of 1994 on the 27th of April can no longer be deferred. The promise of the 27th of April 1994 can no longer be deferred. That spoke volumes of the overall assessment of the ANC government since 1994 by its own president, by the President of the Republic of South Africa, saying they can no longer defer the issuing of South Africans with the necessary essentials and the social security nest that they so much need. They can no longer defer giving South Africans the low-cost housing that they need for those who are in deplorable conditions. They can no longer defer giving people social grants who are even impoverished. They can no longer ignore those who go to bed at night without anything to eat. They can no longer ignore those who have no form of shelter over their heads. This speaks of a president who's cognizant and who's conscious of the socio-economic conditions that the majority of his people that he's leading are subjected to. He goes into detail in saying that this particular pandemic of COVID-19 in this last decade of the National Development Plan, Vision 2030, can no longer be ignored, and they need to accelerate giving people the necessary services that were promised in 1994 in the first election that elected, what may say, the man who gave birth to the president that we have today, the protege of Tata Nelson Mandela, that would be President Cyril Ramaphosa. So he is cognizant of all of the promises that have been made by governments since 1994, and they now need to deliver and accelerate in the pace that they are doing those services to the people. It's unfortunate that the pandemic COVID-19 has had to kickstart service delivery to the people. For instance, if you look at the Department of Housing and Water and Sanitation in the country, and you look at the fast pace that Minister Lindiwe Sisulu and her team are working at in providing people with the necessary shelter in the various areas of Gauteng that our own colleague Thabisa Stole has covered, in the provision of housing for people who are living in informal settlements. You look at the disinfection that is taking place in areas such as informal settlements in the country. You go to Gauteng, the provincial government in Boisens has had a food bank where people are donating food into this provincial initiative of the food bank, and that's where those who are in need of something to eat will be given and be provided with the necessary nutrition by the provincial government. That speaks to the words of President Cyril Ramaphosa, saying that the businessmen, those whom have money, those whom have resources, can no longer ignore the plight of those who face poverty.
Thanks very much, Samkele. You were speaking to Nompu, but thank you so much anyway. That was my colleague Samkele Maseko.